I emerged from the shadow of a small outcropping on the rocky shores of the small island off the coast of Trehan. For those first few years, transportation seriously limited the range I could go to seek out new knowledge. There was, after all, only so far one could walk or ride in a single night, and I required certain somewhat special accommodations to remain there for any length of time. I had since learned that while I still could not transform into a bat and fly, I did have a different natural, or rather unnatural, means of travel. With concentration, shadow walking allowed me to enter the darkness in one place and emerge from it in another. At the time, I didn't really know how it worked, I just knew it did, and with it, I could cover vast distances in an instant. The island of Algaroth was once a haven for pirates and thieves to escape the long arms of Trehanian and Vesobian law. Now abandoned after a series of powerful storms ravaged the island and the coast years ago. That's when the rumors began. Those who escaped the island and made their way back to the mainland scattered across the three kingdoms and carried various stories with them. The more repentant types claimed that it was the wrath of Chidon, god of the sea himself, brought down to punish them for their wicked ways. Others proposed that Queen Renelle of Trehan had conjured up the storms to kill the pirates. None of these stories made a hell of a lot of sense if given more than a passing thought. Chidon is an unpredictable and vengeful god, yes, but he'd have no call for vengeance against a bunch of pirates unless they disrespected the sea. That doesn't seem very likely for a bunch of sailors who essentially live on the unforgiving waves. And if Queen Renelle actually had that kind of power, then why would she have waited for them to set up a nice little settlement so close to her shores before choosing to use it? These were, after all, wanted criminals preying upon Trehanian fishing and trade ships. Unlikely she'd simply sit back and allow it to continue for so long if she had the power to stop it. Every story differed a little here and there in its details, and there was always some mystical force, whether done by the divine or some powerful mortal, but they all ended up similarly unbelievable. But one just sort of stuck with me. A few years ago, an adventuring group calling themselves the Blades of Shadowgrove passed through Dibbleburg on their way to Trehan on some adventure I don't remember much about. It didn't seem particularly interesting to me at the time, you see, so I paid it little attention. Young and foolish adventuring types traveled through the Norgrim Pass often enough that the arrival of one group or another at our local tavern rarely caused much of a stir. They were all the same, really. Loud, overbearing, obnoxious groups of overly inflated egos, eager to impress the locals with their delusions of grandeur and self-importance. The townsfolk were hardly impressed, but they were good at pretending to be. These boasting baboons always had more gold than sense, and prices were always hyper-inflated for these louts, but they never seemed to notice. They threw around their money for a day or two, and then went on their merry way to whatever adventure or shiny bauble they were chasing after. By then, it had grown increasingly rare for me to go down to the village at all. I just didn't have the time, or the need, really. Most everything I needed was in the castle. But on this particular evening, I had been down at the tavern to listen to and arbitrate a dispute between old Mr. Venn, the tavern owner, and Miss Grassley, the new inn owner. Petty disputes are usually handled by my staff, but this was a dispute over property lines that my staff could not settle. Specifically, both Venn and Grassley had claimed ownership of the water well that sat in the yard between them. Venn, of course, said it had always been his and produced the tavern deed to prove it, while Miss Grassley produced the deed she had recently purchased, which stated clearly that it was part of her property. Such is the insanely idiotic crap a local lord must deal with, and such is the precise reason why I never wanted to be a local lord, by the way. But here I was, only half listening to this back and forth bickering with the obvious solution, practically smacking both of them in the face the entire time, when this group, the Blades of Shadowgrove, entered the inn and began the usual adventurer behavior we all abhor. Talking rather loudly and rudely interrupting villagers trying to eat a peaceful dinner after a hard day's work to ask vague and/or leading questions about gods know what. Butting into Venn and Grassley's dispute to order drinks, food, and rooms as though they were visiting royalty and thought nothing else could possibly be more important than their own desires. When they had finally been placated and settled down to eat their meal, they began chatting, ostensibly to each other, but they were telling a story all of them had apparently been a part of, so it made little sense for them to tell it to each other, but they spun their tale just loud enough so the rest of the room could hear them. Clearly, they were trying to impress the peasants with their supposed greatness. They spoke with an accent I wasn't quite familiar with at the time. Evidently, they were from the far eastern kingdom of Etia, a small town named Sasted, from what I gathered. I apologize to the listener that it does not appear on my map, but I am not at all familiar with precisely where it is. They had traveled by ship to Westport and by horseback to Krolon, where they had planned to charter another ship to take them around the Kulak Mountains and into Trehan, where they were in search of some ancient trinket they had heard about. They found that the price was quite steep for such a short voyage around the mountains, and only certain less than savory captains willing to even consider it. Naturally, that made them curious. They were told all manner of disastrous stories about ships that did not make it through the Straits of Algaroth, and some of those that did were empty. Entire crews simply vanished off the decks. It all sounded like poppycock to me, fanciful tales to make a rather mundane occurrence sound more magical than it really was. The small strait between the island of Algaroth and the mainland is strewn with large boulders beneath the waves, and while it is passable during the day, it isn't easy even then. In some places, the pass is so narrow that just a few meters left or right, and the jagged rocks will tear a hole right through the hull. Ships caught in the sudden but natural squalls almost never come out again. They were either dashed along the rocks or run aground on the sandbars. So it was with a great deal of doubt that I sort of listened to their story. Frequently, the sailors aboard these ships were never seen again. Likely they drowned or were battered against the rocks by the waves and the storms. But evidently this group had come across one supposed survivor with a wild tale of some creature called an Anazal. What this creature was exactly wasn't quite clear. The description given was rather vague. Some details seemed to contradict each other, so it was impossible to really know for sure what an Anazal really was. And that, of course, assumed that there was a creature at all. This story very well could have been just the brain-addled tale of a sailor lost at sea for a bit too long. Well, of course, rumors like this were too much for a group of adventuring types to ignore. They insisted on going to sea and investigating this island for themselves. They found a boat and a captain and crew just crazy enough to accept a rather hefty sum to transport them through the straits with a stop at the island itself and set sail the following morning. I could tell from their tone when they told this story that they were actually somewhat disappointed when they finally reached the Straits of Algaroth and everything appeared normal. No storm blew up, no phantom winds or rogue waves tossed the ship about. The captain and crew brought the ship into the abandoned harbor with no incident at all, and the Blades disembarked for what they now expected to be a fruitless exploration of the remains of the makeshift village. As they had feared, there simply was nothing of value to find. Rotting wooden stools, wet and decaying beds, a few rusty spoons, a stray lost or forgotten trinket, but nothing of any value, and certainly nothing that hinted at any sort of mystery. It was just an abandoned village. Somewhat deflated and feeling like fools, they made their way back to the ship for departure, only to discover that the ship was abandoned. The captain and entire crew had simply vanished. There were no tracks or blood trails to follow, no signs of a battle or struggle. They were just gone. Then they were confronted by the booming voice of a man on top of the cliffside, glaring down at them. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Miss Grassley, but I'll not be taken advantage of just because you were," Ven huffed. "You can see for yourself, old fool," she said, stabbing the paper with her finger to make her point. "I bought that well. Says it right here. And I don't much care what that ratty old paper of yours says. This one says I paid for it." "I can't believe this," I groaned as they began to circle back to the same arguments for the fourth time. At last, they had exhausted the last bit of my patience. I grabbed both deeds and tore them up. "There," I said, letting the pieces float to the ground like confetti as they both stood there staring at me in shock. "Now it is my well," I said, and paused for a moment, waiting to see if either would dare challenge me. Wisely, they did not. "You may both use it as long as you run these establishments. If it runs dry, you are responsible for digging it deeper. I will not waste soldiers to do what you folks are perfectly capable of doing for yourselves. Now, if I have to come back here to listen to either of you argue about this well again, I will have it filled in and you will both have to dig new ones for yourselves." Which, Miss Grassley began to ask a question, but I cut her off with a cold stare. I knew what she wanted. She wanted to know which of them was responsible for maintaining it, but the truth is, I didn't care. They were going to be neighbors. They needed to learn to deal with each other, or I'd be forced to come down here every other night to settle some equally stupid argument. If you were interested in the Blades story, then I apologize for the interruption, but evidently I missed quite a bit while handling this matter and cannot tell you what I don't know. They had fought and escaped from something they called an Anazal. I never heard of such a creature before, and I couldn't be quite clear what exactly it was because of what I had missed. But apparently, the man they were initially confronted by, possibly a wizard given the description they gave, was actually some sort of skeletal being or had summoned one maybe, and it was now hurling their group around the battlefield with but a wave of its hand. One of their colleagues had been instantly incinerated by fire summoned by this creature. That was all I overheard on my way out of the tavern that night, and frankly, it all sounded like fairy tales and smokescreens to me. Something may have happened to them. Perhaps it even happened in Algaroth. I knew a good bard will weave just enough truth into their tales to disguise the fiction. I had, after all, heard many of the fanciful fictions about myself. The truth is never quite as dramatic as the stories that come later. I assumed such was the case here as well. That is, until during one of my many research trips, I stumbled upon some very old writings that described the existence of a creature very similar to what the Blades had described. This description made more sense out of what I had evidently misheard. The creature wasn't an Anazal. That must have been its name. If it was indeed what they described, then it was known as a lich. From the literature I had read, liches were formerly very powerful wizards that had cheated death itself. Now, much like myself, they were neither alive nor dead, existing within that sliver in between. Unlike myself, these creatures had an eternal hunger for power, not blood, and no amount they obtained would ever be enough to slake their thirst. Always in search of more and greater magics, they were masters of the arcane, and if he were real, that was exactly the sort of mentor I needed if I wanted to break the spell of a god. If he were real. I didn't have to wait very long to find out. The moment I stepped forth from the shadows, I was frozen in place and felt a dull tingling sensation as though someone or something was crawling around inside my head. After a few moments, there came a raspy voice in my mind. "I do not suffer visitors, Shadow Walker." "I am not just a visitor," I began. "I am a student in search of a mentor." The raspy laughter sent shivers throughout my mind. "There are no teachers here. Only the forgotten." I was immediately blinded when a bright blue flash erupted around me. A bolt of lightning streaking down from the sky blasted right into me. Yet when the dust and smoke settled and my vision readjusted, there I still stood, unscathed. "So you are more than you seem," came the raspy voice. As the tingling in my head grew more intense, I began to understand what was happening. He was telepathically fishing inside my mind, reading my thoughts, trying to learn about me, discover my secrets. "What is this?" he asked himself, and I could feel him pushing at some kind of block inside my mind, as though he were trying to force open a door that wouldn't budge. "What are you hiding, vampire?" Before I could answer, I heard him cry out in pain. The tingling abruptly stopped, and I was no longer frozen in place. Whatever it was had expelled him from my mind and broken his hold on me. A few moments later, I saw a tall, gaunt figure emerge up on the cliff face. It wore robes that may have once been quite fine, but were now shredded, tattered, and faded with time. In his skeletal right hand, he held a staff topped with a shimmering green emerald, the size of my fist, and beneath the cowl of his tattered hood sparkled two glowing red orbs instead of eyes. As he stared down at me from his lofty position, he asked but one question. "Who are you, vampire?